This is the talk tonight for the New World Order. And I'm Jason Lundberg. I am going to be hosting the event tonight. I'm a writer and editor for Epigram Books. And in terms of the series here, New World Order, just to tell you a little bit about this, it's a monthly series. Actually, sometimes more than once a month. It's a monthly series organized by the Arts House that features new local literary voices and discovers emerging talents in the literary art scene. It also gives voice to Singaporean writers and artists exploring new ways of approaching the written word. So I think there's some of these brochures outside. You can see who's coming up. I'll tell you at the end of the program. I'll tell you who's coming up. Actually, just next week, and you can find out more about that. Okay. So in terms of tonight's event, we're here to talk to BALLI Kaur Jaswal. So I'll just introduce her. So BALLI Kaur Jaswal grew up in Singapore, Japan, Russia, and the Philippines. She received her Bachelor with Honors in Creative Writing from Hollins University in Virginia before returning to Singapore to work as a teacher and a business journalist. Her short fiction has been published in Rosebud, Drunken Boat, and Ego magazine. Her short story Painters was nominated for the Pushcart Prize in 2008. Ms. Jaswal was the recipient of the 2007-2008 David T.K. Wong Fellowship at the University of East Anglia, where she wrote Inheritance, which we're going to talk about tonight. Her first novel, which was released earlier this year by Sleepers Publishing in Australia. The novel was selected as a pick of the week and notable new release of 2013 by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age in Melbourne, and has received glowing reviews from a number of publications. And at the risk of embarrassing our guest, I'm going to read you just a few of those. So in Australia's The Monthly, Peter Pierce wrote that with Inheritance, Jaswal makes a debut of imaginative boldness and assurance. For the Melbourne Review, Tali Labi observed that, quote, Inheritance mimics the form of a matryoshka doll. Actually, she said babushka doll, but that's not technically right. With the Singh family's tale sitting within the larger microcosm of Singapore's Punjabi community, and further encircled by the narrative of a newly independent state's shifting identity, BALLI Kaur Jaswal skillfully traverses individual perspectives on both the larger experiences of displacement that beset migrant cultures and the insidious motives of the state. Her writing is as lush as the place she conjures. And Ed Wright at SeekChic.com, which is a fantastic name for a website, noted that Jaswal's prose is pellucid and evocative. It drops the reader easily into the mind of her characters and their dilemmas, and captures wonderfully the paradox of order in the tropics. Having lived in Singapore, Jaswal also offers a nuanced vision of Singaporean society and the workings of the Sikh diaspora within it. Inheritance builds its world simultaneously with anthropological awareness and intimacy. Really good reviews there. Ms. Jaswal has spoken on panels at writers' festivals in Australia and the UK on topics such as independent publishing, writing while traveling, and the ups and downs of writing a first novel. In January 2014, she will start her creative writing residency at Nanyang Technological University, where she will be working on her second novel and leading creative writing workshops for undergraduates. She currently lives in Melbourne, and she tells me that she really likes food that's slightly burnt, and toasted cheese in particular. You can take that as you go. So please, everyone give a warm round of applause for our host. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about Inheritance, and just to give you an idea, in case you haven't read the book yet, just to give you a little bit of context here, the story is a chronicle of this particular family, the Sikh family in Singapore from 1970 to 1990. And these are the main characters that we deal with in the book. So the father is Harbir, the mother is Dalvir, and one thing that is kind of a major source of kind of upset in the family and also kind of disrupts everything is that she actually leaves the family shortly after Amrit's birth. The eldest child is Gurdev, the middle child is Narain, the youngest child is Amrit, and they also have a cousin named Karam who is, I think he's older than Gurdev, right? And he kind of competes with Gurdev in terms of feeling like the eldest child in the family as well, even though he's not technically one of the siblings. Okay, so here's our agenda for the evening. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then Balli will read from an extract from her novel. Then I'll ask some more questions, and then we'll leave the last 10 to 15 minutes or so for Q&A. And I think at that point, or maybe a little bit before, we may be able to get some slips of paper for people if you need them. Actually, there's not very many people here, so so during that point, we'll see how things go with it. Okay, so on we go. All right. Okay, so first question here is, this novel spans 2 decades of Singapore's history. We see the years just after independence, when times are uncertain, yet full of optimism. And then we progress through years of immense change to the landscape and the culture. So what do you think is the psychological effect that these societal changes have on the characters in the novel?
Can everyone hear me? Yes. I think that any story that, or any society that goes through that sort of rapid and urgent change over a couple of decades is going to have an impact on the people of that society. I think the people of that society are going to feel a sense of loss for what they used to have and what is very, very quickly being taken away from them. They're going to feel a sense of having to sort of keep up with the Joneses, and I think that's something that comes through quite a bit in the novel. There's a sense of competitiveness that keeps building, and there's a sense of pressure as well that keeps on impacting the characters. And there are lots of questions. I think each of the characters grapples with questions of, who am I? What is my role in this society? How am I contributing to these changes? And how are these changes impacting me? And most importantly, where do I belong? Am I part of this community, or am I part of this country? And there are lots of questions about identity. As far as psychological impact, I think that the characters experience a huge sort of roller coaster of emotions. And they're often emotions that are at odds with each other. Because there's a sense when your country is changing rapidly, I think there's a sense that you should embrace it. You should embrace the changes, and you should be proud of those changes. But then you should also be a little bit fearful of those changes, and you should, there's something very intimidating about things that change so rapidly and so quickly. And so I think that the characters feel, a great sense of trepidation, but then also a great sense of hope and pride. And those emotions are always sort of at odds with each other. There's always this tug of war of emotions in each of these characters. And that tug of war, I think, manifests itself in different ways and has very different consequences for each of them.
One thing that's really interesting about the way that you structured the novel as well, because we start off in 1970, 70, 71, and then the different parts of the novel jump in time, usually about 7 years or so. And it's really interesting to see kind of that those conflicts are there throughout the book, but that the way that they're kind of manifested as well change with the times changing as well. So in terms of how maybe you approach those different time periods, was there anything in terms of considering what was going on during those times specifically that you were looking at, or was it just kind of general change that you were looking at?
I was looking at general change. I think what I really wanted to achieve was a set of snapshots of this family, and I really wanted to be sort of a fly on the wall and to observe, the everyday lives of this family, and to think of them and to consider how they would react to the different contextual things that happened, during that time. But I think in our day-to-day lives, I don't think that we're affected so much by big political changes or big social changes. I think it's just little subtle things, and I think that's what comes through in the novel, and that's what I try to do in the novel anyway. Just sort of show there's reactions to little things that are changing around them. The ripple effects of those bigger changes that are occurring.
Okay. There's also a constant strain throughout the book between modernity, I always mess up that word, and tradition. So there's like that conflict there. Harbir, the father, is very traditional both in his outlook and his beliefs, and Gurdev and Karan, like I mentioned, they kind of compete for his approval to be like the eldest son and the more favored one. Yet Harbir's younger children, Narain and Amrit, are thoroughly engaged in a rebellion, both quiet and dramatic, against this traditionalism, and I'll come back to that later in another question. So what role do you see Singapore's embrace of modernity, often at the expense of tradition, having on the lives of your characters?
I couldn't see myself writing a book about Singapore without having that tension between one, but I messed up that word.
It's a hard word.
Modernity, modernity and tradition, because that's one of the biggest things about Singapore. I think it's such a paradoxical country. It's a place where, you know, traditions exist side by side with rapid development, and it's never quite this or that. And it's one of those things, you know, when you try to describe Singapore to outsiders, if you describe traditional things, they have this view of it as being one thing, as being a conservative society, which it really isn't. If you walk around in Singapore, it isn't a very conservative society. And so that balance between the two, and that constant struggle between the two, is something that I really wanted to consider when I was writing the novel. Initially, it started off as a conflict for just one character. There's, you know, the main character, Amrit, is mentally ill, and it started off as, you know, I started to think about, well, how would a Sikh family in Singapore treat someone who's mentally ill? How would they recognize it? How would they treat the symptoms? And I realized that they couldn't approach that conflict without a huge clash of ideology, a huge clash between, well, this is what we should do, and, well, this is what's always been done. And so that's sort of where it started with that conflict. And then it started to become relevant to all the characters. It started to become a theme, and it started to become a real thread that was woven into each of the characters' stories, that, you know, as they tried to react to Amrit, their own sort of ideas about modernity and tradition, and their own I guess they started to feel a bit challenged by their perspectives of tradition, and they started to sort of reassess their identities as traditional or modern citizens of this country. And I think that that's something that's relevant to all of us. I think that's something that we face every day. You know, a sense that we really need to consider how modern we are and how traditional we are, and whether one can be, can be embraced at the expense of the other, or if we should be sort of, you know, doing this juggling act all the time.
It's interesting you just mentioned that you had started with this being like Amrit's story. When you initially wrote this, started writing this, was it just from her point of view?
It actually wasn't. This novel actually has a really funny beginning. I was given a task in a creative writing class to write an entire story in 3 pages. And as you can see, it's 3 pages. So I failed that task. But you know, it was meant to be a story in 3 pages. And so I ended up writing that first chapter, which is actually from Narain's point of view. I wrote that chapter in 3 pages. So it was very, very contained, and it was very, very quick. And even as I was writing his chapter, even though it was from his perspective and it was things that were going on in his life, there was a sense that, you know, he was haunted by Amrit. There were things that were going on with Amrit that weren't quite right, and those were the central things that were happening in his life. And initially, in earlier drafts of the novel, she was very, very central to all of their lives, to the point where the story was a bit too small and a bit too restricted.
Yeah, when I read the back cover blurb at first, I thought it was going to be all about her, because that's what it talks about how the family fissures that develop after Amrit disappears in the middle of the night, and that happens very, very early in the book. And so I was glad to see that wasn't what it was all about, because it's about all these characters, and it's really interesting too that each chapter alternates point of view, and it's not always the same pattern. So, but it's who we need to hear from, I guess, at that point in time. So, really interesting. Okay. We're going to sidestep the more obvious autobiographical questions about the fact that the book is about a Sikh family in Singapore, and you yourself are a Sikh woman who grew up and lived and worked in Singapore. But if we could just follow a tangential strain instead, what was it about these particular characters that you found so compelling that you had to take this 3-page, encapsulated story and make a whole novel out of it?
I was overseas at the time that I wrote those 3 pages, and it was at a time when I was really sort of trying to make decisions about where I should be, and all those questions that I mentioned earlier, who am I, where do I belong, and all that, those were, at the forefront of my mind all the time. And to me, I think it's really important, if you want to live in a place and if you want to identify with a place, then you need to start examining the society that you're going to be a part of, or the society that you are a part of. I think for this novel, and I think in general as well, if you want to examine a society, if you want to explore the nuances of the society, there's no better place to start than with a family. There's no better, place to be, as I said before, a fly on the wall than a family, because every family is a microcosm of society. Every family has, its own set rules, its own set of expectations, its own system of governance, its own hierarchy, its own politics. And I thought that would be a really fascinating way to sort of explore the wider conflicts of the society by thinking about how families interact with each other and how they relate to each other, and how those power struggles sort of play out among, between different people within a family. And so through that, I started to, looking at a family quite intimately. I thought it made for a really convenient sort of route into looking into, or taking a very intimate look at a society. And so what it ended up being was an intimate look at a family through the lens of fiction. And the lens of fiction happened to be something that opened up the story to make sort of wider comments about the way our society is and perhaps the way it should be.
But it feels, as you read it as well, it feels very epic. And I think that's I think you just put it exactly right. I think it's just taking that kind of microcosm of the family and examining the entire society that way. I think that's how that happens, I guess, that kind of epic feel to it. Okay, so I think at this point, I'd like to ask you to read an extract, if you would. So we'll have a passage from the book.
All right. I'm going to read a chapter from, it's somewhere in the, well, you can see it's somewhere in the middle of the book, and there's been a little bit of context established already. It's a chapter from the point of view of Harbier, and it's, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. The notice of his father's condition came by telephone one evening. Harbier heard the strained voice of Rabinder, a distant cousin in Punjab, mumbling the details of Papa's weakening heart. He knew that any matter necessitating a long-distance phone call was grave. Rabinder made every effort to use euphemisms in describing Papa's illness and the doctor's diagnosis, but Harbier knew that his father would die soon. He thanked his cousin and returned to his bedroom to retrieve 2 pillows and a sheet. The next telephone call from India might come at an odd hour, and he couldn't miss it, so he set up the rattan sofa as a bed. Each night, as he tried to fall asleep, he felt the immovable weight of his father's impending death, as if time was also running out for him. He ached to speak to Papa, but how was that possible? Even if Papa was conscious, it would be disrespectful to a dying man to hold a phone to his ear and compel him to speak. Harbier had always known such a time would come. It was a migrant sacrifice, a distance so vast it seemed immeasurable. For comfort, he sought the image that had always soothed him, his father's lush farmland in Punjab. Instantly, his square 18th-story flat was transformed with wild stalks of green grass and cattle roaming between clouds of golden dust. One night, as he tried to sleep, Dalbir came in for a secret visit. When he, Amrit, and Narayan had first moved into this flat 2 years ago, he thought it would be the end of Dalbir's appearances. She would not favor the tall concrete building, and discreet entrances would be impossible without a back door. These government housing blocks were built to prevent secrets. At dusk, the fluorescent lamps in the hallways blinked on, and stairwells and corridors were exposed. Yet Dalbir's visits continued. She entered through the front door late at night, knowing that Harbier did not lock it in case Amrit returned without her key. When Dalbir sat down next to him, the stench of dirt and sweat that clung to her clothes drifted through the flat. She must have been searching for cures for Amrit again. This had become Dalbir's mission since it had occurred to her that Amrit was possessed by a stubborn and tenacious spirit. He pretended to share her faith in the supernatural, only because he had run out of explanations for Amrit's behavior. On those evenings, Dalbir had blended an old-fashioned potion, turmeric, fennel seeds, mashed red dates, and holy water from the temple. Then she instructed Harbir to visit Amrit while she was sleeping, stand over her, and chant a prayer, sprinkling the liquid over her mattress. She had collected Amrit's hair from the bathroom sink and wrapped it in a small package with seeds and sticks, which she handed to Harbir. Together, they said prayers before going outside during a rainstorm. He had twisted the package into the earth, feeling Amrit's curse lifting as his fingers sank. Once, Dalbir was even bold enough to go to Amrit's door while she slept and listen to her unsteady breathing. Afterwards, she had mixed holy water and mint leaves into her morning tea and left Harbir with detailed instructions. That day, Amrit did not wait till noon, and while Harbir was in his room writing his letters, she left the flat and did not come back for 3 days. After that day, Harbir ordered Dalbir to stop with her cures, but, of course, she defied him and searched for them in secret. Now Harbir waited for Dalbir to settle into the flat, and then he told her that his father was dying. Her face softened with sympathy, and she reached out to stroke his hand. At her touch, he began to weep. Within moments, he was wiping the tears away, embarrassed at his grief. Dalbir stayed at his side until he finished crying, and then she let herself out of the flat as swiftly as she had entered. He remembered how, when they were first married, she would trace the rungs of his spine with her fingers as he fell asleep. He always thought this was something she had learned to do, some soothing massage her mother had passed down to her, until he turned to her one night and saw on her moonlit face an expression of pure wonder. He had realized only then that he was married to a child. He was just 18 and she 15. The phone rang the following night when Harbir was fast asleep. He has passed, Ravinder told him. A respectful pause, and then, you will receive the land papers in the mail. He left everything to you. Long-distance phone calls, Harbir had to remember, was still expensive in the village. Telephone connections from India were poor, so any news or information had to be crammed into one conversation. Had there been an upcoming wedding in the family, it would have been announced in the same breath as the death. Nevertheless, both announcements arriving at once gave Harbir the sensation of his limbs being pulled in opposite directions, the grief of his father's passing and the joy of his new wealth. He cleared the living room methodically, picking up the pillows and folding the sheets before he changed his mind and decided to strip them all and put them in the wash. A plump moon dangled low in the window like a pendant. Harbir settled at his desk with a pad and a pen. He wrote the estimated amount of the land's worth at the top of the page and then listed his children's names in a column on the left. Gurdev, Naren, Amrit, and then he wrote Karan's name. Wasn't it only fair that Karan received some of the money as well? He would receive the same amount as Gurdev, Harbir decided. He stared at Naren's name. The boy had yet to pay him back for the years of tuition spent on that university education in Iowa. For what? He had graduated 3 years ago, and he had a job as a civil engineer in a private company, but Harbir suspected his habits had not changed. Lately, he had been coming home late in the evenings, stinking of sweat, with no apologies or explanations as to his whereabouts. Sometimes Harbir wanted to ask Naren whether his stay in America had done him any good. Had the independence of living in a new country turned him into a man? But somehow, Harbir knew Naren's answer, and he couldn't bear to hear it. Harbir expected a bigger payback than just tuition money. Naren's job was to protect the family reputation by making sure that Amrit stayed on the right path. 6 years had passed now since Amrit's first disappearance, and Naren had failed in these responsibilities as well. Amrit drank whiskey with strange, classless men. She had no qualifications. She was not able to hold down a job. Harbir decided he would give Naren a token amount and no more. He looked over the figures again and, dissatisfied, crossed them out and started over, applying a more benevolent logic this time. Perhaps Naren should get a higher amount as an incentive. Maybe Gurdev deserved all the money because he had 2 small children. Harbir grumbled softly to himself and pictured his father's land scarred and chopped into uneven pieces. He divided the sum again, this time in equal parts for all his children. The numbers still didn't look satisfactory. Why should Gurdev get as much as Karan? Why should Amrit get any at all? He flung the pen across the room with a frustrated cry. Outside, he heard Amrit's bedroom door creak open and her footsteps shuffling along the tiles. She must have returned while he was asleep, just before the phone call. She stopped at his door. "Are you okay?" she asked. Harbir recalled an incident a couple of years ago when Amrit came home late, stinking of beer, and passed out on her bed. He had towered over her limp body and slipped off his belt in a rage, ready to teach her a lesson and set her straight. He raised his arm high above his head, but when he brought it down, the belt buckle clanged against the bedpost, missing Amrit's body and waking her with a start. She stared at him, frightened, only enraging him further. He tried to hit her again, but the belt slipped from his grip and wiggled to the floor like a fish. "It's nothing," he called back when he saw the doorknob turning. "No need to come in here." He stared down at the sheet, at the numbers. Next to Amrit's name, there was a blank. What portion did the girl deserve? Any amount would look like a reward when all she brought to him was grief. Things were being said about Amrit. At every turn, Harbir heard jokes about his name and reputation. The early evening breeze carried the neighbors' collective disapproval into his thoughts. The announcer on the neighbors' radio seemed to broadcast Amrit's latest crime and the unfit parenting that prompted her to do it. The whole world was talking about Amrit. "Can I bring you something? A hot drink?" Amrit asked from outside the door. Harbir shut his eyes to banish her voice. Why did she show her concern in gestures like this, but then did so much to shame him? He did not answer, and eventually she wandered away, her shadow clearing in the gap beneath the door. Harbir could only think of one possibility for Amrit's future. The idea had been brewing for some years now, but each time he brought it up with Delia, she refused and begged him to let her try more remedies first. He knew why she was so opposed to an arranged marriage for Amrit. He saw the faint disgust in her eyes, recalling that hairy, piggish thing that men enjoyed and women tolerated. Years after they were married, Delia told him that her own mother had prepared her for marriage only by alluding to this act, which was a necessary routine to drive the silliness out of a girl and turn her into a wife. Marriage was a proven cure. For a particular type of girl, it showed her that there was no joy in the act, only a routine consideration of her husband's needs. Harbir considered the changes in his own temperament after he got married. "If you had stayed," he once told Delia, "I might have become an even better man." Delia was not here to oppose his decision now. He looked at the pad and sprang from his seat to pace the room, allowing his idea to gain momentum. Yes, 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 he thought excitedly. He searched the floor for a pen and brought it to his lips for luck before letting it touch the pad. Next to Amrit's name, he fiercely scribbled the names that came to mind.
Okay. And that section actually segues really right to my next question. Because in terms of the inheritance of the title, so it refers to a couple of things. One is the inheritance you just mentioned, the literal inheritance that Harbir receives after his father dies. And as you read, he has to split this up between his children and figure out who's going to get what. And that also leads to some conflict later in the book, especially between Gardin and Karam. So there's that inheritance, but there's also this metaphorical inheritance of kind of crushing social expectations faced by each character. So are there larger scale inheritances in play here as well? Inheritances of the Sikh community or of Singapore as a whole, for example?
I think before answering that question, I do have to confess to you all that Inheritance was not the original title of the book. The original title was When Amrit Returns, because it felt as if all the characters' lives were in a sort of standstill until Amrit sort of came back to the state that she was in when they were progressing and moving forward. And instead they were all sort of frozen in time, and Singapore kept rapidly developing, but they were sort of stuck and frozen where they were. My publishers and I had a long conversation, many long conversations about the title, and they ultimately decided that a title with a character's name in it might alienate audiences or might, I guess discourage people from picking the book off the shelves, which I thought was very fair. When we came up with the title Inheritance, or when they came up with it, I thought it was perfect. I thought it had so many associations with it that matched themes in the book, and it actually made for a much richer reading of the book, actually, because it just made it fit into so many different dimensions of the story. And when I finally had a title for the book, I told my colleagues about it, and I work in a school. And one of my colleagues, who's an accounting teacher, said, "Oh, it sounds like it's about property." And I said, "It is. It does have a bit of property." And then my colleague, who's a biology teacher, went, "It sounds like it's about genetics." And I said, "It is." So there were all of these different connections that were made to it. And it is that there is that inheritance, that very literal inheritance, the land that is shared, and there is also what is passed down. And I think what I found really compelling about it is that I think when you grow up in a particular community, within a community, as a Sikh community is, a small community within a small community of Singaporeans, you inherit, I guess, a set of expectations about how you should behave. You inherit a set of really beautiful customs as well. You inherit a language, not innately, but there's an expectation that you will sort of take these things on. As Singaporeans, I think we also inherit, a set of behaviors, a set of norms, a set of customs, and a set of traditions. And again, those are things that we learn. They're inherited because we take them on. The question that I have, and the question that I pose in the book, however, is how much do we have to take on and how much can we let go of? How much are we expected to hold on to? And how much can we, discard? Or should we be discarding any of it? And I think, there's also a wider question. Sorry, I wrote something down about it. I think anyone with that migrant sort of sensibility, anyone who grows up in a migrant community feels that they've arrived somewhere and that they have to sort of continue the journey for their parents. They have to, continue to live a better life. So it's about, what you take from and what you adopt from your parents, but then also what you create with that. And I think each of these characters find that a bit of a struggle. They find that, that they're expected to be a certain way, but better.
Okay. Speaking of your characters, there were two characters for me that were really interesting. They really kind of stand out for me. And these were actually the younger two children in the family. So Narain, the middle child, he's sent to America to study engineering. And he also has to reconcile his sense of duty to his family, as you mentioned, with taking care of Amrit, making sure that she behaves. He does an okay job with that, but kind of fails, kind of succeeds. So he has to reconcile this with also this burgeoning certainty about his homosexuality as well. And Amrit, the youngest sibling, who we learn is afflicted with bipolar disorder, we actually get that name late in the book because they didn't know what they were dealing with at first. And who could only fill the void in her life with alcohol and the attention of unsavory men. So my question is, what drew you to examining the lives of such emotionally damaged people?
I think two things always motivate me to write. The first is a sense that there has to be conflict, a feeling that I have to fix things. and I really don't think that there would be much interesting writing out there if there weren't emotionally damaged people to write about. There needs to be something to fix. And I think as a writer, you try to play God a little bit, and you try to make things a little bit easier for people. First, you have to make things really hard for them, though. So you have to create these characters that they're having a really, really hard time in life. The other thing that motivates me, and motivated me in particular with this novel, because it's my first novel, is I have a very strong sense of justice. and I felt a very, very strong sense that these characters were not being fairly treated by their society. They were being perceived as deviants. They're being perceived as dangerous people. They kept being pushed sort of further and further into the margins, because ultimately the characters do triumph. These two characters do sort of find their place in society. I wanted to comment on the fact that we have a tendency to think that anyone who deviates from the norm needs a solution, needs a very, very quick fix, and without us really sort of trying to understand who they are or where that comes from. And what I wanted to comment on most as well was that as a society, maybe we need to sort of look inward and think, well, what is it about our expectations that are a little bit damaged? You know, what is it about our expectations of people that's, you know, a little bit flawed, that we can't accept people or can't look a little bit beyond the surface and try to think about people as people and as individuals.
Yeah, as you say, you kind of, and many writers do this, put your characters through hell, and those two particularly, they get through a lot of hell in this book, and that's one of the things that made me kind of gravitate toward them, because I was rooting for them, because they had so much against them, and to see, even when they get, you know, little tiny victories, it's you know, you kind of, there's a high point in the book, and you kind of root for them, and then you keep going to see if they're going to, you know, triumph over that. So those two, but there's also the character of the mother, Delia, who was really fascinating for me, and in particular because she's kind of on the borders of the book. We don't see a lot from her. Definitely, we don't see her thoughts until the kind of the last third of the book or so. She's a very haunting character. So she leaves the family after Amrit is born, and as you mentioned in that passage, she periodically returns in secret to visit Harbir, but only him. She doesn't want to visit the children. She only wants to visit with him. And so, and she acts as his counsel when the children are growing up, but doesn't actually want to, you know, see them herself. So it's a really kind of interesting kind of internal thing that's going on there. And at times it was hard for me to get a hold on this character because of that. You know, you think, you know, it's a natural kind of maternal instinct. You would think of a mother wanting to see her children, and yet she doesn't. And so it kind of plays against that. So it's a really interesting tension there. So what were some of the most fun parts about writing such a mysterious character as this?
I think everything about writing this character is really fun. Actually, she's in such a privileged position. You know, she comes and goes when she pleases. She is very, very proud of her sense of tradition. She really believes that that's the cure, that's how that's how things are going to get better. And she's not necessarily proven wrong by the end of the novel. And I made sure that there was a little bit of ambiguity as to, you know, how things would be better, you know, from different perspectives. I think it going back to the idea of tradition and modernity, I think they're both ways or both sides have something right. I really enjoyed, you know, the mystery of it, and what I enjoyed most was the fact that she was really, really connected to everyone, but at the same time she was very disconnected. So she wasn't physically there in a lot of the events of the novel, but she was tuned in, she knew what was happening, and it was really rewarding and really satisfying to finally write her point of view, because there was a lot of build up to that, but it wasn't necessarily build up that I had to write. It was build up, you know, it was sort of laid out and paved for her by the other characters. So when she finally does give her perspective, it's for me it was a relief to write that, because I could finally let out the things that I wanted to say from her point of view. And she's a very strong and independent character, and that was something I wanted to get across as well. I think about Sikh women, they are very strong and very independent in their own right, even though outwardly there's a lot of silence and a lot of, I guess, a sense of restriction. There's a lot intellectually that's there that I think that we bypass sometimes.
It's interesting too, because as a reader, when we finally get to that section, I think it's in part 5, when we actually do get, you know, the part of that story from her point of view. It was also a relief for me as a reader, because it was the same kind of thing. As I was reading along, I really wanted to know more about her and to figure out her motivations and, you know, why is she, you know, acting the way that she has, and just to know more about her because she was so mysterious and cool. And then we finally get that. It's like, oh, that's a really cool moment. So, okay, so I think at this point, I've got a couple more questions, but I think at this point, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if y'all have questions for Balli, please ask them now. I don't think we need to pass a microphone around. You can just say them, speak up. But I know this is the part when everybody gets really quiet. Nobody wants to go first. So does anybody have any questions? Or how should I say, who has the first question?
Yeah, I can ask it. I'm just trying to frame it. I've just I've just come in from overseas and only knew about this event a couple of days ago, so I haven't read the book. That's my preliminary to that. So my question is more about, I suppose, you as a writer rather than you as a writer of this book. And I'm wondering, just from what you two have been talking about, I'm wondering about whether a writer needs a nationality to write a book like this. Did you need to be Singaporean to write this? Could you have written this book if you weren't Singaporean? Could you write The Great Australian Novel? You obviously lived in a lot of different places.
I don't think I would be confident writing, especially for a first novel, I don't think I would have been confident writing anything else, anything that wasn't about nationality and identity. Because that's a really, really big thing for me. Having grown up in so many different places, there was always that question of, where do I belong and what is the society? What are the things that make the society tick? That said, though, the longer I live in a place, the more I feel familiar with it, and the more I feel like I'm getting to know it very authentically, and really, really settling in. And then the stories start to come to me. When I first moved to a place, the stories that come to me are very superficial. They're very much about, very, very sort of surface level things, and things that I don't fully understand about a culture. And I've only just recently started to, have some Australian stories that are brewing in my mind. But again, they're migrant stories. There's some element of my identity in that, because I can't claim to know what it's like to grow up Australian in Australia. Not yet anyway. I mean, if I was in that community more, maybe I would.
Who else would like to ask a question? If I could just kind of piggyback on that as well, just to kind of offer my own point of view, because I've been here for 6 years now. So obviously I'm not here from here. So I've been here for 6 years now, and it's a lot of the stories that I write. A lot of them are that same kind of, maybe not so much migrant stories, but a lot of outsider stories. So you tend to write about the culture you know the best. Because and some of it too is like if you don't really feel like a sense of ownership, but if you haven't been there long enough, it's like you're kind of pretending.
Yeah, you feel a bit fraudulent.
Yeah, if they're gonna catch you out.
But then there have been great narratives written by people who are not from that culture. Like there's countless examples, and there are men who have written as women. J.K. Rowling just wrote as a man, as a male detective. So I think it can be done. I think it takes a great deal of confidence and research and really immersing yourself in that. And for me, this was a story that was really bringing, inside me. This is a story that I really wanted to tell, and this was a story that I felt that I knew best because it just felt very personal, very intimate to me. But yeah, with my next novel, I'll go a little bit outside my comfort zone.
I haven't read the book, but you mentioned that it's post-war.
Yes.
Till today, and you're obviously too young to know.
Thank you.
Anything about post-war?
Yeah.
So how much did you write about post-war, and what sort of research did you have to do to write about those times?
That's a great question. I started off just writing. The details that I wrote were details that I remembered from growing up in late 80s, early 90s, which wasn't the same, I know, as 60s and 70s. And my gauge for that was remembering, when my parents would say, "Oh, this is like what Singapore used to be," So I kind of know sort of what old Singapore was like. And then I sort of developed those details a bit further. I did quite a bit of research. I went to sort of old places on the island, places that again people would go, "This is what Singapore used to be like." There was a great collection of photographs as well that the Straits Times put together. I think it was like an anthology of all of the Straits Times headlines and photographs from the past 50 years. And I looked at things like that, just looked at them and just wrote down what I thought and what I felt. And really just, tried to get a sense of what the country was like. Most of those details are in the background, and most of them are physical descriptions, so I focus very much on that.
Who else would like to ask a question?
like to know who is your favorite author.
My favorite author, it always changes. It changes.
It's always a difficult question to ask a writer.
I think one book that did have a huge impact on me though was The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. Partly because of again that sense of injustice that you feel when you read about things that happen in this wider society and how they impact the lives of this family and that ripple effect. I found that story just fascinating and very multi-layered. When it first came out, there was a lot of hype about it, because it won the Booker Prize, and I was 14, I think, and I didn't understand anything, and I read it like pretending that I knew what it was talking about. And then a few years later, I read it in high school, and it really had an impact on me.
Yes, I read the book as well, but I was wondering, how does marginalization actually present itself in the text?
Quite a bit. Pretty much everyone in the story is marginalized in some way, some more severely than others. I think all the characters, by default, feel a sense of being marginalized because they are from a very, very small community. They're Punjabi Sikhs in a country where there are very, very few Punjabi Sikhs and very few Indians. So they're a minority within a minority. And so they feel a sense that they have to sort of represent or wear their culture and wear their identities on their sleeve a lot. Naren's character is marginalized because he's considered a sexual deviant because he's a homosexual, and he gets quite early in the novel you find out that he is thrown out of the army because of that. Amrit is marginalized because she's mentally ill, but we don't quite understand that until the end. Gurdev's character, who is also very fun to write, is marginalized by his daughters because they represent the new modern Singapore, and he's sort of stuck in tradition, and they're constantly pushing him to the corner. And Harbir's character is marginalized by just everything that's going on around him, that sense of loss that he feels for his homeland, Punjab, and then also his sense of loss for the country that keeps developing and developing in front of him, and changing in front of his eyes. That he feels that he should be proud of, but at the same time he feels that he should try to hold on to in some way, and he keeps sort of slipping away from his fingers. So they're all pretty messed up, these characters. They all have a pretty hard time.
Yeah. That's what makes them so interesting. Okay, I'll just ask one last question here. And you actually just mentioned it as well. You're going to be working on your second novel in your residency. Can you tell us anything about it?
Yes, I can even tell you the title.
Until the publisher.
I changed it. It's going, brace yourselves, it's called Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows. It's about a group of old Punjabi women in Southall, which is a very concentrated Sikh community in London. They mistakenly take a literacy class, which then evolves into a storytelling class where they compose naughty stories. I've always sort of wondered about what little old Punjabi ladies talk about. And in my imagination, that's what they're doing. They're composing these little narratives about maybe the way things could have been for them. It's a dark comedy.
That's fantastic. Okay. Well, if there's no more questions. Okay. In terms of getting a hold of the book, we're hoping to have some copies here, but that didn't happen tonight. But there are copies at Books Actually in Tiong Bahru, and I know at Kino Kuniya on Orchard Road. I don't know if there's any at the smaller Kino location, but Orchard definitely has a bunch of copies. So please get a copy. That's a fantastic, wonderful book. I do have an announcement in terms of the next edition of New World Order. It's going to be actually next week, a week from today, on the 15th of August at 7:30 p.m. In the Play Den, and it's going to feature the new Singapore creative writing resident at NUS, one of the two there, playwright Daniel Ko, who's going to read from his past works and share his plans of what he'll be doing during the residency. So that should be, I know the host for that is Yume Balasingham Chow. So that should be a really fascinating evening, so I hope you all will come for that. I think there's maybe some feedback forms at the door.